There is an organization that has never held a press conference, never published its budget, and never answered to the public. Yet for nearly 80 years, it has quietly shaped the course of history on every inhabited continent. This is the story of the CIA, and it is far stranger than anything Hollywood has invented. Go back to the autumn of 1945. The guns have just gone quiet. Nazi Germany is ash and rubble. Japan has surrendered under the shadow of 2 atomic blasts. On paper, America has won. But inside the Truman administration, the mood is closer to panic than triumph. Europe is a shattered continent, and the Soviet Red Army sits occupying half of it. Stalin is methodically strangling the life out of Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, and every capital within his reach. Washington's problem is brutally simple. Nobody knows what he's going to do next. At that moment, the United States government's only intelligence arm was the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS. It had done useful work sabotaging Nazi supply lines and dropping agents behind enemy lines. But against the Soviet intelligence machine, the OSS was outclassed at every turn. Moscow's networks were decades old, ruthlessly disciplined, and embedded deep inside Western institutions. Even America's closest ally, Britain's MI6, kept secrets from Washington. The hard truth was that the U.S. had won the war through sheer industrial muscle, not through superior intelligence gathering. Harry Truman took the oath of office in April 1945 after Franklin Roosevelt's sudden death. After the fighting ended, he initially disbanded the OSS entirely. But within months, reality forced a rethink. A superpower that knew nothing about its chief rival was flying blind over a minefield. Something new, something permanent, something with real teeth had to be built. The answer was drafted in sealed rooms inside the newly formed National Security Council. A small group of officials debated, argued, and ultimately agreed. America needed a peacetime spy agency, something that had never existed in the country's history. The result was the Central Intelligence Agency, formally created by the National Security Act of 1947. Its legal mandate was deliberately written in loose, expansive language. Beyond gathering intelligence, the CIA was authorized to carry out such other functions and duties related to intelligence as directed by the National Security Council. That vague phrase was not an accident. It was a skeleton key. It gave the agency the legal cover to do almost anything, almost anywhere, with almost no public accountability. The founders had a clear vision, a globe-spanning network of agents and informants, covert action teams trained to remove unfriendly leaders, propaganda operations capable of steering public opinion in foreign countries, and critically, a chain of command that ran straight to the president, bypassing Congress and the American public entirely. The vision was bold, but bold visions need money, and asking Congress openly for funds to bribe foreign politicians and topple foreign governments was not really an option. The answer came wrapped inside one of the most celebrated programs in American history. After the war, Europe lay in physical and economic ruin. Tens of millions were homeless, malnourished, and desperate. Communism, which promised bread and order, was gaining political ground fast across France, Italy, and Greece. President Truman responded with the Truman Doctrine, pledging to support free nations resisting subjugation. Secretary of State George Marshall followed with something bigger and more concrete, a massive American-funded reconstruction program for Europe. Over 4 years, more than $13 billion flowed across the Atlantic, equivalent to well over $150 billion in today's money. Food, fuel, machinery, infrastructure, the Marshall Plan. But buried inside the program's fine print was a secret clause. 5% of those funds, roughly $685 million, was quietly funneled to the CIA. That money did not rebuild bridges or restock grain warehouses. It bribed politicians, paid newspaper editors to publish pro-American stories, bankrolled friendly labor unions, and funded propaganda campaigns designed to keep European voters away from communist candidates. The CIA now had its war chest. The shadow war could begin in earnest. Only it didn't go well. Not at first. In the late 1940s, the Soviet KGB was simply in a different league. Decades of ruthless tradecraft had turned it into a machine that was nearly impossible to penetrate. The CIA was new, overconfident, and riddled with problems it didn't even know it had. One early mission captures the scale of the disaster perfectly. A team of Ukrainian agents, trained and equipped by the CIA, parachuted into Soviet-held territory. The operation was doomed before the plane left the runway. One of the key handlers on the mission was secretly working for the KGB. Every detail of the plan had been handed over before the agents hit the ground. Within days, every one of them was dead or captured. This wasn't a one-off failure. Pattern after pattern emerged, missions blown before they started, agents arrested within hours of insertion, networks unraveled overnight. An internal review used blunt language. The CIA was fatally penetrated. The damage went beyond individual operations. The agency's credibility was so badly wounded that recruiting new assets became nearly impossible. Nobody wanted to work for a spy service with such a catastrophic record for getting its own people killed. The director at the time, Walter Bedell Smith, understood that the agency needed a victory, something loud enough to convince the White House it was competent, and frightening enough to give adversaries pause. That opportunity arrived not in Eastern Europe, but in the oil fields of the Middle East. Iran, 1953. Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh had done something the British regarded as unthinkable. He nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, a move that stripped London of the oil wealth it had been extracting from the country for decades. Britain was furious and essentially helpless to act militarily, so it turned to Washington and asked the CIA to fix the problem. The CIA approved a plan codenamed Operation Ajax. The man chosen to execute it was a CIA officer named Kermit Roosevelt, Jr., grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt. He slipped into Tehran carrying more than $1 million in agency funds. The strategy wasn't complicated. It was just effective. Members of Parliament were bought. Newspaper editors were paid to run stories portraying Mossadegh as a corrupt communist stooge. Radio broadcasts rallied loyalists of the Shah. Military officers sympathetic to the royal family were quietly organized and armed. When the operation initially stumbled, Roosevelt pushed harder. Paid mobs clashed with Mossadegh's supporters in the streets. On August 19th, soldiers stormed the prime minister's residence. Mossadegh fled over a garden wall but was caught within hours. The coup was complete. Back at CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, Operation Ajax was celebrated as a masterpiece. Clean, swift, and decisive. A democracy had been toppled, an elected leader imprisoned, and a pro-Western monarch restored, all for about $1 million and a few weeks of work. What nobody in Langley talked about much was the long-term cost. By removing a democratically elected government for the sake of oil contracts, America had planted seeds of resentment that would keep growing for decades. Those seeds would eventually bloom into something that would haunt the United States far more than Mossadegh ever could. The mid-1950s became a blur of covert interventions. Guatemala, 1954. President Jacobo Arbenz was toppled through a combination of CIA-backed propaganda, mercenary forces, and economic pressure. Another apparent win, but results started getting mixed. In Indonesia, attempts to destabilize President Sukarno fizzled badly. In Cuba, early plots against Fidel Castro went nowhere. In Eastern Europe, operation after operation was rolled up by the KGB before it could achieve anything. The CIA's leadership looked at the pattern and drew a conclusion. America was not built to win a spy versus spy ground war. The KGB had too much experience, too deep an infrastructure, and too many moles inside Western services. But America was built to do something no other country could match: engineer its way out of problems. If you couldn't outspy the Soviets, maybe you could out-engineer them. The result was the U-2. Reconnaissance aviation in the early Cold War was terrifyingly dangerous. Modified American bombers and fighter jets flying over Soviet territory were visible to radar, catchable by interceptors, and vulnerable to missiles. The Soviets were constructing nuclear facilities and missile sites at a furious pace, and Washington desperately needed to know where they all were. Existing methods simply couldn't provide that safely. CIA Director Allen Dulles partnered with the Air Force. A brilliant planner named Richard Bissell took charge of the project. Lockheed's secretive Skunk Works division, under the legendary engineer Kelly Johnson, handled the design. What they produced was extraordinary. The U-2 was a jet aircraft capable of cruising at 70,000 feet, higher than any Soviet fighter could reach, higher than any missile of that era could reliably intercept. Its wings stretched over 100 feet, like a powered glider, giving it the lift needed to float through the stratosphere for hours. Cameras built into its belly could resolve objects 2 feet wide from 13 miles above the surface. Its range allowed it to cross the entire Soviet landmass without refueling. The Soviets could watch it on radar screens. They couldn't do a thing about it. Every mission returned with rolls of film that rewrote what American planners thought they knew about Soviet military capability. For the first time, the CIA wasn't guessing about the enemy's strength. It was seeing for itself. This wasn't just an aircraft. It was a spy satellite with a human pilot, and it transformed American intelligence. While the U-2 was reshaping reconnaissance, another theater was heating up. Since the 1954 Geneva Accords split Vietnam along the 17th parallel, the U.S. had been maneuvering to prevent the Communist North from absorbing the South. Officially, American personnel were there as advisors. In practice, the CIA was already deeply embedded in the conflict, running covert operations across Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. U-2 flights mapped North Vietnamese supply routes and the winding jungle logistics network, known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Those photographs fed directly into strike planning. CIA-backed Hmong militias in Laos ambushed supply convoys and blew up weapons depots. A covert airline operation, Air America, shuttled guns, radios, and operatives into remote jungle airstrips across the region. In Saigon, political figures deemed inconvenient were bribed, pressured, or quietly removed. The money that funded all of this moved through channels designed to be invisible. Black budgets, foreign currency reserves, and arrangements that no congressional oversight committee would ever see. In some areas, CIA-affiliated operations tolerated or actively worked alongside narcotics traffickers in exchange for cash that could fund operations without any official paper trail. Opium cultivation in Laos, heroin trafficking in Cambodia, all of it quietly sustained a shadow war that the State Department pretended not to know about. By the mid-1960s, the covert campaign appeared to be achieving results. Supply lines were disrupted, enemy commanders were eliminated, and South Vietnam kept buying time. It felt like a manageable conflict. Within a few years, it would spiral into the most costly and divisive war in modern American history. Before Vietnam reached full catastrophe, the CIA absorbed another spectacular humiliation. April 1961, a force of Cuban exiles, trained, armed, and organized by the CIA, landed on the beaches of southern Cuba at a place called the Bay of Pigs. The plan was to trigger a popular uprising and overthrow Fidel Castro. The plan collapsed almost immediately. Promised air cover was canceled. The expected popular revolt never materialized. Castro's forces swept the beaches, killing and capturing the invaders with brutal efficiency. For President Kennedy, who had inherited and then approved the operation, the failure was a personal catastrophe. He reportedly told aides he couldn't understand how he had been foolish enough to trust the advice he'd been given, and that he would never again allow himself to be bowled over by the certainty of generals and intelligence officials. The Bay of Pigs didn't end the CIA's anti-Castro obsession, but it permanently dented the agency's aura of invincibility. Washington's focus on stopping communism's spread didn't dim. It just shifted geography. South America became the next arena, specifically Chile. In 1970, Chilean voters elected Salvador Allende as president, the first freely elected Marxist head of government anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. Allende nationalized key industries, built relationships with Cuba and the Soviet Union, and began rolling out socialist policies. For the Nixon administration, this was a nightmare. A communist government with democratic legitimacy right there in South America. The CIA was ordered to ensure Allende's government did not survive. The agency poured millions into opposition newspapers and broadcast media. It funded strikes by truckers and business groups that throttled Chile's economy. CIA officers quietly cultivated relationships with sympathetic military commanders. The economic pressure was relentless. The Chilean currency cratered, food shortages spread, and political instability deepened. On September 11, 1973, the Chilean military moved. Led by General Augusto Pinochet, tanks rolled through Santiago and surrounded the presidential palace. Allende died inside as it burned. Pinochet seized power and established a military dictatorship that tortured and disappeared thousands of political opponents over the following years. Washington relaxed. Chile was back in the anti-communist column. The price was a functioning democracy and thousands of lives, and the whole world had been watching. Meanwhile, inside the United States itself, the CIA had crossed a line it was never supposed to cross. Legally barred from domestic operations, the agency began funding student organizations, placing agents inside journalism, steering cultural groups, and even some civil rights organizations toward positions it found useful. American citizens were being manipulated by their own intelligence service. Worse still, a program operating under the name MKUltra had for years conducted experiments on people who had no idea what was being done to them. Under the direction of a CIA chemist named Sidney Gottlieb, researchers dosed unwitting subjects with LSD, subjected people to sensory deprivation, and pushed psychological pressure to the point of torture. The program's goal was nothing less than mind control, specifically the ability to make a person carry out acts they would never willingly choose. The CIA wanted to know whether it could manufacture an assassin who would forget what he had done. The experiments were grotesque, illegal, and conducted on a wider scale than most people ever imagined. The mid-1970s hit the CIA from multiple directions simultaneously. The Vietnam War ended with American helicopters evacuating people from a Saigon rooftop, one of the most searing images of national failure in the country's history. Watergate drove Nixon from the presidency in disgrace. Senate investigations, led by committees chaired by Frank Church and Otis Pike, tore back the curtain on decades of CIA abuses. The public learned about the domestic spying, the mind control experiments, the assassination plots, and the illegal surveillance. Trust in the agency evaporated, but underneath the public humiliation, the CIA's operational machinery kept turning. Secret accounts in Swiss and Caribbean banks kept covert funds circulating. Shell companies masked arms transfers and political payments. The habits built up over 30 years didn't disappear because of a few congressional hearings. They just went deeper underground. In the early 1980s, a new crisis opened up an entirely new dimension of CIA finance and another genuinely dangerous entanglement. Iran had undergone an Islamic revolution that swept away the Shah, who was closely identified with American interests. Officially, Washington treated the new Iran as a hostile state, but 3 Americans, a journalist, a diplomat, and a minister, had been kidnapped in Beirut by Hezbollah, a militant group with deep ties to Tehran. Getting them back required leverage, and the CIA helped engineer an arrangement that would eventually explode into one of the worst scandals in the agency's history. Through a chain of intermediaries, key figures in the Reagan administration and the CIA arranged to sell missiles, spare parts, and other military equipment to Iran. The price was deliberately inflated. In return, Iran would quietly use its influence over Hezbollah to push for the hostages' release. The profits from these covert arms sales didn't stay in the Middle East. They were routed through Swiss bank accounts and offshore companies into Central America, where they funded the Contras, a rebel force fighting to overthrow the leftist Sandinista government in Nicaragua. Congressional law specifically prohibited sending U.S. government money to the Contras. The administration had found a way around that prohibition, and the arms sales weren't the only funding stream. CIA-connected networks in Central America looked the other way, or in some cases collaborated actively, as cocaine traffickers moved product northward, so long as the cash was recycled into Contra operations. The same airstrips that flew guns south were used to fly drugs north, with the proceeds disappearing into the Shadow Wars accounts. When the arrangement unraveled and broke publicly in 1986, the scandal consumed Washington. Congressional hearings, criminal indictments, and public outrage followed. Iran-Contra remains one of the most brazen violations of legal constraints in CIA history. But even that scandal was eventually overshadowed by a purely financial story. The Bank of Credit and Commerce International, known as BCCI, was technically headquartered in Luxembourg and Pakistan. It marketed itself as the Bank of the Developing World, welcoming clients that reputable Western institutions wouldn't touch. Arms dealers, drug cartel bosses, and corrupt government officials all found BCCI's discretion accommodating. Billions of dollars in criminally derived money moved through its accounts. The CIA found the bank enormously useful. BCCI's labyrinth of shell accounts and offshore subsidiaries was perfectly designed for moving covert funds without leaving a legible trail. Operations in Afghanistan, Latin America, and the Middle East were quietly financed through its channels. Intelligence agencies from multiple countries used its books to hide transactions from oversight. In 1991, regulators in 7 countries coordinated a simultaneous shutdown of BCCI, exposing a criminal enterprise that had laundered money for cartels, terrorists, and governments alike. The scandal damaged the CIA's public standing, but the agency had long since learned to absorb scandals and keep operating. Something far more consequential was about to happen. The Soviet Union was dying. In 1991, the USSR collapsed with a speed that stunned even the people watching it most closely. Economic failure, nationalist movements, and political unrest had finally overwhelmed the system. The red flag over the Kremlin came down. The Cold War, nearly half a century of global confrontation, was over. For the CIA, this was a genuinely disorienting moment. The KGB, its great rival, had been an enemy that matched the agency in cunning, ruthlessness, and global reach. The two organizations had shaped each other over decades, each evolving in response to the other's moves. With the Soviet collapse, that enemy was simply gone. The CIA had been built to fight the Cold War. Now there was no Cold War. The agency's very reason for existing had seemingly evaporated overnight, and nobody had a clear answer for what came next. The 1990s in Washington were defined by prosperity, optimism, and a deliberate turning away from the darker aspects of statecraft. President Clinton focused on economic growth, trade expansion, and domestic policy. Intelligence budgets were cut, CIA overseas stations were closed, networks built up painstakingly over decades were quietly dismantled, and experienced officers retired without replacements being hired. The threats that remained, ethnic conflicts in the Balkans, instability in Africa, drug cartels in South America, rogue states testing missiles, were real but felt manageable. The existential confrontation was over. Nobody noticed what was building quietly in the Afghan mountains and in training camps in Sudan. Through the 1990s, Osama bin Laden was constructing a genuinely global militant network. Al-Qaeda recruited fighters from multiple countries, trained them methodically in guerrilla warfare and bomb-making, and organized them into disciplined cells capable of operating independently across continents. There were specific opportunities when the CIA and U.S. military could have struck bin Laden directly. Each one slipped away through a combination of bad intelligence, political hesitation, and missed timing. By the late 1990s, bin Laden commanded a well-funded organization with active cells in the Middle East, East Africa, Europe, and inside the United States. Al-Qaeda was not operating in isolation. Hezbollah, Hamas, and regional groups like Jamaat Islamiyah in Southeast Asia formed a loose network of organizations with overlapping goals and some shared infrastructure. Then came the previews. The simultaneous bombing of American embassies in Kenya and Tanzania in 1998 killed over 200 people and wounded thousands. The attack on the USS Cole in Yemen in 2000 killed 17 American sailors. Each strike was more coordinated and deadlier than the last. The intelligence community scrambled, warning lights were flashing, and yet the full picture of what bin Laden was planning remained out of reach. September 11, 2001 announced itself on a clear blue Tuesday morning. 4 commercial airliners were hijacked within minutes of each other. 2 crashed into the World Trade Center's Twin Towers in Lower Manhattan. 1 hit the Pentagon in Virginia, and a 4th went down in a Pennsylvania field after passengers fought back against the hijackers. The Twin Towers burned and then collapsed. Nearly 3,000 people were dead before noon. For the CIA, the failure was total and undeniable. The attack had been planned for years, involved operatives who had lived openly in the United States, and had been prefigured by warnings the agency had failed to act on decisively. The mission going forward was singular and without ambiguity. Find the people responsible, find their networks, and destroy them. In 2003, the CIA produced the intelligence justification for invading Iraq. Satellite imagery, accounts from defectors, and intercepted communications were assembled into a case that Saddam Hussein's government was concealing active programs for producing weapons of mass destruction. The case was presented to the United Nations Security Council with high confidence and considerable drama. It was wrong. The intelligence had been built on unreliable sources, assumptions that confirmed what policymakers wanted to hear, and a failure to rigorously challenge the underlying logic. American and coalition forces invaded Iraq. Baghdad fell in weeks. Saddam Hussein was captured, tried, and eventually executed. But when investigators went looking for the weapons stockpiles that had justified the war, they found nothing. The WMDs did not exist. The intelligence failure was catastrophic, arguably the worst in the CIA's history. And it led directly into a war that would grind on for years, cost trillions of dollars, kill hundreds of thousands of people, and ultimately strengthen Iran's regional influence, rather than diminish it. Inside Iraq and Afghanistan, the CIA threw itself into operations on a scale that dwarfed anything from the Cold War years. Budgets exploded. Billions poured into intelligence collection, surveillance infrastructure, and covert action programs. And in the mountains and deserts of both countries, a new weapon was being perfected, one that would eventually redefine how America wages war. The traditional methods of targeted killing were expensive, risky, and messy. Special operations raids required planning, personnel on the ground, and acceptable exit routes. Car bombs and covert assassinations left fingerprints. The CIA wanted something faster, cleaner, and deployable anywhere on Earth without requiring a single American boot on the target's soil. The answer was the armed drone. Early reconnaissance drones had been flying since the 1990s, cameras floating silently above conflict zones. The transformative leap came when engineers figured out how to arm them. The Predator drone, fitted with Hellfire missiles, became simultaneously a surveillance platform and a precision weapon. The larger MQ-9 Reaper extended the concept further, capable of loitering over a target zone for 24 hours continuously, with cameras that could read a vehicle's license plate from miles away and infrared sensors that pierced darkness and cloud cover alike. The pilot sat at a ground station in Nevada, while the aircraft hunted over Pakistan or Yemen, thousands of miles away. A single operator could track a target across a city for days, then fire the moment the geometry aligned. For the CIA, this was a revolution in covert action. No agents risked, no diplomatic incidents from soldiers captured on foreign soil. A kill list could be worked through with clinical efficiency. In Yemen, a convoy erupted in fire from a missile no one heard coming. In Pakistan, a compound vanished in a plume of smoke and dust. In Somalia, a militant cell that had gathered in a courtyard was gone before it dispersed. Each strike was recorded and filed, a permanent record of kills made from thousands of miles away. But one target eluded every drone and every operation for nearly a decade. After September 11th, Osama bin Laden had slipped away from an American military tightening at Tora Bora in Afghanistan and disappeared into Pakistan. For years, every lead went cold. Every informant produced noise rather than signal. The world's most wanted man had made himself into a ghost. The break came in 2010. Analysts tracking a courier's movements across Pakistan followed the man to a large, high-walled compound in Abbottabad, a garrison city not far from Pakistan's military academy. The compound was conspicuous for what it lacked. No internet connection, no telephone landlines, security measures far beyond what the property's apparent value would justify. CIA analysts concluded with high confidence that bin Laden was living there. Getting him out would require going into Pakistan without warning or permission, and without telling Islamabad, since the CIA suspected elements of Pakistani intelligence might tip off the target. Navy SEAL Team 6 trained for the mission. On the night of May 2, 2011, 2 helicopters crossed the Pakistan border. The team cleared the compound floor by floor in minutes. On the 3rd floor, they found bin Laden. 2 shots ended the hunt that had consumed the CIA for nearly 10 years. His body was flown out, identified through DNA testing, and buried at sea to prevent his grave from becoming a shrine. The operation was as close to a perfect mission as the CIA had ever run. Patient, methodical analysis, painstaking surveillance, precise execution, and a clean exit. After the Bay of Pigs, after the WMD failure in Iraq, after decades of embarrassments large and small, Abbottabad felt like vindication. But killing bin Laden did not extinguish the threat he had spent a lifetime building. Al-Qaeda splintered and adapted, pushing authority down to regional affiliates that were harder to monitor precisely because they operated with so much local autonomy. New groups emerged, adopting similar ideologies and methods while operating under different names and in different countries. The challenge shifted from finding a single network's leadership to monitoring a diffuse and decentralized landscape of threats that could materialize almost anywhere. Solving that problem required something different, not just better drones or more field operatives, but a completely new way of processing information. The CIA found what it was looking for in an unlikely place. A man named Alex Karp grew up in Philadelphia, the son of a pediatrician and an artist. His academic path led him to social theory and eventually a doctorate from a university in Frankfurt, Germany. He had no background in intelligence, no military experience, no obvious connection to the national security world. In 2003, he partnered with Peter Thiel, the PayPal co-founder who had become one of Silicon Valley's most influential investors. Thiel had a question he couldn't stop thinking about. What if the analytical power that technology companies use to organize information could be turned toward finding terrorists? Together, Karp and Thiel built Palantir, named for the seeing stones in J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, objects that let their bearers see events happening far away. The CIA's venture capital arm MKUltra invested early. Palantir's engineers worked directly with intelligence analysts, designing tools in response to real operational problems rather than theoretical use cases. What Palantir built was a platform for connecting disparate data at scale. Phone records, travel histories, financial transfers, surveillance footage, live drone feeds, social network activity, all of it could be pulled into a single analytical environment, where relationships between people, money, and movements became visible that no human analyst working through individual sources could ever have detected. A terrorist cell's financial network might be invisible if you looked at bank records alone, but overlay those records against travel patterns and communication metadata, and the structure emerges. A safe house in a crowded city might generate no obvious intelligence signals, but the behavioral patterns of the people moving in and out of it tell a story to the right analytical tools. For the CIA, this changed the pace and precision of operations dramatically. Targets that would have taken months to locate could be identified in days. Entire terrorist cells could be mapped before they carried out an attack, allowing disruption rather than retaliation. Drug cartels that had relied on physical cash and face-to-face meetings to stay anonymous found their networks rendered transparent by pattern analysis. Even in densely populated urban environments, behavioral signatures that no individual analyst could perceive became apparent when enough data streams ran through Palantir's system simultaneously. Today, the CIA operates with one of the largest classified budgets in American history. Billions flow annually into cyber operations, advanced surveillance systems, artificial intelligence-assisted analysis, and covert action programs across the globe. The agency that Harry Truman created in a hurry in 1947 to fight a single adversary now confronts a landscape of threats that would have been unrecognizable to its founders. Recent reporting has pointed to expanded offensive cyber capabilities, drone operations that have spread from Afghanistan and Pakistan into Yemen, Somalia, Syria, and beyond, and deepening collaboration between the CIA and the technology sector. The war in Ukraine has pulled the agency back into a familiar mode, proxy conflict, with American intelligence providing targeting support, training, and operational guidance to Ukrainian forces fighting a Russian military that looks in some ways like the old Soviet enemy. But Russia is arguably no longer the primary concern. China has emerged as something qualitatively different. Not an imitator trying to replicate Cold War-era Soviet tactics, but a near-peer competitor that leads the world in several critical technologies. Hypersonic weapons, mass AI-powered surveillance infrastructure, quantum communications research. China's intelligence services have conducted some of the most damaging espionage operations in American history, stealing military and commercial secrets on a scale that dwarfs anything the Soviets managed. And unlike the Soviet Union, China is not economically isolated. It is woven into the global economy in ways that make confrontation far more complicated than the Cold War ever was. Looking back across nearly 80 years, the CIA's record is not easy to summarize cleanly. It has achieved things that genuinely changed history, some of them worth celebrating, many of them deeply troubling. It toppled elected governments in Iran, Guatemala, and Chile. It ran experiments on its own citizens without their knowledge or consent. It financed operations through drug trafficking and criminal banks. It presided over one of the greatest intelligence failures in modern history in the run-up to the Iraq War. It also flew aircraft that prevented nuclear miscalculation. It tracked down the architect of the deadliest terrorist attack in modern history after a decade-long hunt. It pioneered technologies that now define how all major intelligence services operate. It held the line at tremendous cost and through deeply questionable methods during a global confrontation that could easily have turned nuclear. The world the CIA now operates in is more complicated, faster moving, and less forgiving of mistakes than anything it has faced before. Information moves at the speed of electricity. Political crises ignite without warning. Societies are more tightly connected and therefore more fragile, more vulnerable to disruption at precisely the points where interconnection creates dependency. One blind spot at the wrong moment, one intelligence failure that triggers the wrong response, one miscalculation in an environment where everything is linked to everything else, and the consequences could spiral beyond anyone's ability to contain. The organization that was built in secret, funded in secret, and has operated in secret for the better part of a century has never faced stakes quite like the ones it faces now.